Hey, this is Mr. Arvites again. This is a coronavirus history lesson. We're in U.S. history, and we're now at the Battle of the Bulge. We're going to be looking at that to the fall of Germany. And at this point in time, we have to kind of look at the Germans and understand. In the last video, we looked at, they started losing battles in France. They lost Paris. They're being pushed across. The Russians, meanwhile, are pushing across the Eastern Front into Poland in 1945, and then eventually into Germany. And so the Allies are poised to strike a decisive blow on Hitler. Now, Hitler is going to use the Battle of the Bulge as a last-ditch effort to try and force a peace settlement by the Allies. He hopes to encircle Allied armies, force a surrender, and then force a peace settlement. That is not going to happen, by the way. Winston Churchill would never allow it. Neither will FDR, and Joseph Stalin would have lost his mind if the Allies in the West had done that. Well, Hitler is going to plan this anyway. 200,000 German soldiers are going to be launched into the Battle of the Bulge on top of the already 50,000 soldiers they had there. And so what we're looking at are tanks and everything else. Everything Germany has is going to be thrusted into this. Panzer divisions, SS divisions, and the Allies are going to be caught completely off guard on December 14th. Now, why is all of this even there? It's because Market Garden essentially failed, and the Allies couldn't push into Holland far enough to gain a foothold into Germany. And so on December 14th, when the Germans invaded, the Allies are caught off guard. They have to ship soldiers in quick. They don't have enough winter clothing, and unfortunately, they're going to get hit by one of the worst winters in 50 years in Europe. And so as the blizzards and snowstorms and freezing temperatures are coming in, as are the German tanks, as are the shells and everything else. Now, the Battle of the Bulge is fought across Belgium near the Ardennes, and one of the things that is immensely important about this battle that I think you need to kind of take into account is that the Germans are winning at first. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because they push through the American lines and they form a bulge in the American lines. Now, the Americans will hold fast and the reinforcements will do that. However, there are going to be a number of American groupings that will be completely surrounded, including the 101st Airborne. This was obviously made famous for a lot of you in the Band of Brothers miniseries. And if you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend it. The episodes on the Battle of the Bulge are insanely good and very powerful. So highly recommend checking that out. Read the book too. The book's very good. So the Battle of the Bulge, with Easy Company being surrounded at Bastogne, that becomes kind of the signature event that a lot of people recognize now, but the whole event is pretty horrible. I mean, American soldiers are freezing to death. They're also getting shot. They're also getting shelled day and night. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne are surrounded. They're in foxholes in and around the little town of Bastogne, and the Germans are besieging them. And so it's just hell on earth everywhere. And on December 20th, when this thing started, they're told they're not going to have any reinforcements. And so they have to ration out food, ration out medical supplies, ration out everything. The casualties will start adding up. We're talking about 50% from that 101st Airborne will have some sort of casualty, killed, wounded, missing type thing, right? Now, on December 24th, the day before Christmas, the Germans decide that they're going to offer a settlement for the 101st. They say, look, you can surrender now or you will be destroyed. And the response the 101st gives is one of the greatest responses, of course, in military history. They respond back with a 4-letter word, and not like what you're thinking. They respond back with nuts. Like, do this or you're dead. Nuts. And the Germans were quite perplexed by this. They were kind of confused, and they were saying, hey, what does this even mean? They call up a POW, and he's like, oh, just, nuts. And they got pretty mad about this, started to siege him. It's at this point in time, by the way, that Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to get his general staff together and says, look, we need to liberate these boys. We cannot let them just be obliterated by the Germans. And all the generals are like, this is impossible. This is impossible. Well, leave it up to George Patton to say it's not. And George Patton and his Third Army, right, are going to push across the Ardennes Forest, and they're going to push into the Battle of the Bulge and help liberate, quote unquote, the 101st. The 101st will counter that argument. And in fact, most veterans of that group do not say Patton liberated them. They say they fought out of it. And regardless of that debate amongst soldiers, it is rather remarkable. The U.S. military was able to muster up enough resources, enough movement in a winter where we were short on all of these things. We are short on resources right now. That's why we haven't pushed into Germany, because Market Garden used a lot of those things. Stuff in the Pacific, including the invasion of the Philippines, was using a lot of these resources. And so for us to do this was a remarkable feat. And one of the things that allowed us to get these movements, allowed us to get these quick ball things, is a group called the Red Ball Express. The Red Ball Express are immensely important. African-American primarily. These are truck drivers who move supplies. They move specifically gas, food, weapons, all that stuff. And they're going to be the ones who allow us to move forward with our mechanized army. Remember, the U.S. is the most mechanized army in the world. We use trucks for everything. We're not like the Germans. The Germans are still using horses to move artillery. Everything for us is mechanized. So we need fuel, and the Red Ball Express will facilitate that. It's not a job that gets a lot of glory, but without that job, there is no victory, okay? So as the Battle of the Bulge ends, the Germans suffer 100,000 casualties. The U.S. and Allies suffer over 80,000 casualties. It's immensely violent. There's another battle that's really important too, called the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. Highly recommend checking that one out. But we're going to leave that one out of this little lesson for today. So as winter ends, right, we get the conference at Yalta. The conference at Yalta in 1945, the Allied powers, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR are going to divide up Europe, sort of. Well, Stalin says he's going to divide up Europe. Churchill gets really mad, and FDR kind of says, we need to end the war in Germany first. And that becomes the big thing. We're going to beat Germany first, move on to Japan. Stalin agrees to help us out with Japan so long as Germany loses. It's at this point that both Allied sides, the East and the West, decide they need to get to Berlin first. And so there is going to be a push, right? But for the U.S., it's going to take us a while to get across the Rhine River. It'll take us all the way until, really the second, third month of 1945 to get across that Rhine River. Meanwhile, the Russians are pushing across Poland, and they are going to take large-scale amounts of territory. They will also begin to liberate concentration camps. And that brings us to a different point. It's at this point that the Allied powers, even though they knew about them, begin to realize the scope in which the Holocaust was. And as they liberated camp after camp after camp, this became even harder to realize. We see our first camps liberated in the northern parts of Europe, and then eventually they liberate Dachau, liberate Auschwitz in Poland, and all these different things. And the Nazi regime gets painted in a totally new light. This is no longer a war against an enemy country. This is a war against, almost like a monster, if you will. And the full light of Nazi atrocities is now going to be shed. But that's a story for a different lecture. We're going to look at that a little bit more specifically next week. But either way, as the Americans push across Germany, as the Russians push into Germany, we see untold amounts of war crimes, by the way. The Russians are going to take a lot of this out on German civilians. We see lots of rape. We see lots of murders by the Russians, just the same as the Nazis did to them on the Eastern Front. So a little war of attrition. The U.S. will have its fair share of events as well. Soldiers obviously liberating concentration camps. There are numerous events of soldiers executing the prison guards at those camps if they catch them. These things happen. The other big events are going to be bombings. In fact, the firebombing of Dresden in 1945 is one of the most traumatic. We're talking tens of thousands of people dying in Dresden. They create large-scale firestorms, the British do, by using incendiary bombs and then bombing roadways so fire trucks and stuff can't get by. And they are going to destroy that city, and it's going to be complete chaos, wreckage. You're going to see charred bodies of people in the middle of the street. Everything is gone. The city is going to be rubbled. We see that across whole-scale Germany. We see just the large-scale bombing and destruction of Germany across the board. At this point, Germany is done in terms of an effective military fighting force. Now, from the military standpoint, the Allies in the West depended on three major generals to get their coordination of strategies, and that's going to be Bernard Montgomery for the British, that's going to be George Patton for the Americans, and then, of course, Omar Bradley for the Americans. These three guys who didn't always get along are going to combine to be an unstoppable force, and they're going to push across Germany. Now, before they can get to Berlin, though, on April 16th, the Russians get there, and they're going to besiege the city. Hitler is then going to give the orders that all Germans, able-bodied Germans, should fight. And so they're going to have 13, 14, 15-year-old kids fighting in Berlin, along with 70-year-old men. And Berlin is going to be defended by the young and the old, and they're going to die, indiscriminately as a result. Hitler, at this point, begins to blame the German people for the failure of the war. He says they failed him, and they should be punished for this. Hitler ultimately will take his life on April 30th, 1945, in his bunker, scared. Right, he shoots himself in the head, takes cyanide capsule. His body is going to be brought up to the surface and lit on fire and burned. A number of other high-up Nazi officials also commit suicide. The really most creepy one is Joseph Goebbels. Joseph Goebbels and his wife will poison their children in the bunker, and they will euthanize them in their sleep, and then they too will shoot themselves in the head, committing suicide. And so the Nazi Reich falls 12 years in, so not 1,000 years. 1 week later, on May 8th, 1945, Germany unconditionally surrenders to the Allies. We know this day as VE Day. The Russians celebrate this every year with large parades. In the United States, we had a massive parade, obviously, for the celebration. But the war is not over. Keep in mind, the Japanese theater will last all the way until September. So until next time, Mr. Arvites.